I am joined from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, by my favorite historian, David Beito, who, and I'll say this again, but it's even more true now. I mean, I think you are one of the most important revisionist historians of the 20th century United States. I think no one has done more damage to the legacy and history of liberalism, the Democratic Party, in particular, Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, which is still the dominant way, sort of the dominant, what am I trying to say here, is still the centerpiece of liberal ideology, I would say. FDR is still the central hero for most liberals and even a lot of leftists, by the way. Most socialists I know call for a new deal, a new deal. And it's pretty much been unquestioned and unchallenged, even by conservatives. Even Donald Trump is a fan of FDR. But let's talk about your book, which just came out, your recent book, which is a full biography. It's behind you right there. Full biography of the man, FDR. Um, what I want to do before we get into the critique, David, is to try to understand the way that liberals think about FDR. What is it that they see in the history of FDR as a politician, as a president, and et cetera? What do we commonly think of FDR? How are we taught to think about FDR?
Well, FDR, as you said, is highly ranked, number one, number two among people on the left. He'd be an easy number one. And what is the secret? I've got some radical Marxist friends. They're big FDR defenders, and you
Yeah.
bring up aspects of FDR like Japanese internment. You bring up the poor civil rights record, which, by the way, I think he's vulnerable on all those issues. But they tend to sort of explain it away like those are aberrations. Those aren't really where he was at. And so what do they like about FDR? Well, certainly they like the FDR's views on the welfare state. He's the creator of the modern welfare state, and they think that's a good thing. They like his emphasis on the economic Bill of Rights. They like that rhetoric. But I think it's FDR, the persona. And I think this is where my parents were coming from. My parents were not big leftists, but they were New Dealers. And there was a real there's a real style that FDR had. He was the wealthy planter, the guy that doesn't have to do it, right? He just could count his money and be comfortable, but here he is going out there for public service, right?
Hmm.
So I think he went over a lot better than someone like a Huey Long would have been with the same position, because people would always say, well, FDR didn't have to do it. I sort of say he's sort of a Thurston Howell with a heart, right? He's got that, sounds like Thurston Howell actually, and he's got this sort of aristocratic demeanor. He's
Hmm.
got this charm, much more effective than Trump, in the fine art of not going on the personal attack, but also launching very effective attacks on his opponents. Never got personal, rarely got personal. And that was part of his effectiveness.
Right.
The guy that gave us the phallus speech, right? Brilliant. So FDR is very good at kind of uh, communicating this idea that he really cares, um, that he's on your side, that he is simpatico with you, that he's looking out for you. And he does it with this charm and this aristocratic demeanor. It's just all one big package that people find appealing. People on the left find it appealing. And part of the reason they find it appealing is, FDR's speeches were so general. They were so, you know, uh, you can't really find a racist speech by FDR, right? You could maybe if you looked hard enough,
Oh, this
but
not
he
speech,
doesn't.
not speeches, but you can
He's the
find
guy that
writing.
brings in Japanese internment, but he never speaks about it, right? He has these retrograde civil rights policies, but you're never going to catch him on saying anything racist specifically. So, I mean, I think that's part of it too.
Hmm.
It's just the persona.
Yeah.
Uh,
So
the
here,
well,
here,
I don't know if I'm putting it the right way, but I'm
no, no, no.
trying to.
That's, I
Yeah,
mean, I
yeah.
think that's one angle, but I think the summary in the minds of most liberals and most Americans who know anything about history is what I was taught in high school, and here's how it goes. And it's a powerful argument before you start looking at the actual history. The argument is the United States and the world was in a Great Depression when he took office in 1933. And then at the very same time, there was a rise of fascism in the world, in Europe and in Asia, they say, which constituted direct threats, if not to the United States itself, to democracy and freedom and the civil rights that we all cherish. And what FDR did was he ended the Great Depression through the New Deal programs and by launching an annihilatory war against the fascist powers. And he won. He defeated fascism. I think this is even the title of a book about FDR. He defeated fascism and saved America from communism. Because if the Depression had continued, the story goes, and the Communist Party was at its height in the 1930s, if the Great Depression had continued, the Communist Party would have become a dominant force in America, which is not completely insane to say. There were at least a million members or fellow travelers of the Communist Party in the 1930s. And of course, communism feeds off of economic crises. But FDR defeated fascism and saved America from communism and saved America from economic collapse. So, David Beito, who in the hell do you think you are calling into question, clearly by objective standards, the greatest president in our history? So, what would you say to that? Because you will
You
be
got me.
hearing that.
You're giving me a lot to respond to. First of all, uh, I don't. The standard argument FDR would make and his defenders make is he saved the system or he saved capitalism,
Yep.
right? Without him, what would have happened? God knows what.
Yep.
Well, if you look at this objectively, the Communist Party, the communist candidates, the socialist candidates did very poorly in the 1932 election. Um, and socialists didn't elect a single member of Congress. They'd had one in the 1920s. They didn't elect one in the
Mm-hmm.
during the 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
Um, um, so they do very poorly. So where is the threat of a revolution from the left? Really, if there's a threat of a revolution from the left, I would say becomes a little bit more potent, if you want to call it the left, when you get the rise of people like Huey Long and Father Coughlin. But that doesn't really start in earnest till about 1934 and 1935, well into FDR's first term. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't see the evidence that there's a threat of a revolution from the left. Where is it? So if FDR is saving capitalism, who is it saving him from? If anything, we have movements during the early 1930s, which are sort of anti-statist in many ways, like the tax revolt. We have tax strikes and this kind of thing.
Yeah.
FDR does not run on a New Deal agenda. He uses the term New Deal, but he runs a rather conventional campaign which attacks Hoover simultaneously from both the left in a very vague way, but more often really from the right,
Mm-hmm.
calling Hoover a big spender. So that argument that he's saving us from something worse, I just don't see the evidence that we are on the verge of a revolution, even close to it, because politics is fairly conventional. One way to look at the question of the great ending of the Great Depression, of course, is that on the eve of World War II, we still have double-digit unemployment. So depressions usually in American history lasted 2 or 3 years. This one lasts much longer, both because of the policies of Hoover and the policies of Roosevelt. So he was a failure in getting us out of the Great Depression. One little thought experiment I
Right.
try in the book is imagine if FDR had not run for a third term, that he had, as most people thought he was going to do, that he just didn't, he decided to step down and pass the mantle to somebody else. A lot of people thought he was going to do that and retired after 2 terms. How would FDR be assessed now, even by mainstream
Mm,
historians?
mm,
I think there'd be a lot more criticism because
hmm.
here's a man that would have ended his second term with double-digit unemployment. So that's a failure. Uh, I mean, you could look at foreign affairs. You know, we had the outbreak of World War II in Europe. Uh, FDR had actually supported the Munich Agreement, interestingly enough. So, I mean, there would have been a lot of criticism for what's going on in foreign policy. Like, doesn't he bear some responsibility for that? And then if we look at civil liberties and civil rights,
Mm,
we had the attacks on civil liberties by the Black Committee, for example. Very bad civil liberties record. And then in civil rights, year after year, Walter White of the NAACP is literally begging FDR to take action. He does nothing on anti-lynching bills. At the end of FDR's term, his own conservative vice president, John Nance Garner, says we got to do something about lynching. FDR's response when he hears about Garner is he laughs uncontrollably. You know, could you imagine Garner saying this? My God. Now, what would a normal sort of humane person do? He would say, gee, Garner's for an anti lynching bill. I guess we can get it now.
hmm.
No, he didn't do that. So he, very poor civil rights record. So, how would this guy be ranked? I think even mainstream historians, had it not been for FDR, the wartime leader, would have there. I don't think he would have ranked as highly. Let's put it
Yeah.
this way, because by these objective standards, not very successful.
Yeah. Unemployment was around 20% throughout his first 2 terms. It never really went below that. It was always double digits, but it was usually around 20%. And so, yes, and well, that's true even until the war. I mean, it was around 20% until 1940, until Lend-Lease. So for 8 years, his first 8 years, the economy looked about the same, right?
Yeah, and I think it was even double digits at the time of Pearl Harbor, gone down, but it's still that's not a recovery, right?
Right,
After all this time,
right,
comparing it to say the 1921-22 recession, for example.
right. And in the process, so we're going to talk about economics and civil liberties at the same time here. In the process, in attempting to rectify the Depression, he instituted radical economic reconstruction, right, of the national economy, which looked a lot like, and I have argued, pretty much identical to the economic models in Germany and Italy at the time, right? Which we call corporatism. So, in a sense, he didn't defeat fascism. Fascism won, would be my argument. What do you
That's a
think
very
about
good
that?
argument.
Oh, it
Yes.
is. Okay. Well,
I agree.
I wish you had said it in your book.
Well, I probably could have said it. That's
Yeah.
right. He did say, however, as I have in my book, he described, and this is from a very good book that you called my attention 2 years ago, the guy with the long German name. What is that thing called?
Oh,
The book
Shivelbush, Wolfgang.
Chivalbush, yes.
Yeah.
Where, and then I've seen other things too, where FDR was sending his ambassador off to Italy, and he says, "Please say hello to that admirable
Oh,
Italian gentleman." Of course, he
oh,
meant Mussolini.
oh, yeah.
And FDR's own son said that father admired Mussolini.
Yep.
He thought very highly of him. And so this was self-consciously borrowing. Labor policy was an example of this. Collective bargaining. The fascists had collective bargaining. Many other countries did not do collective bargaining. They did a system called plural bargaining.
Right.
So that's another example where we're really borrowing from Italian corporatism.
Right.
And so FDR is an admirer of Mussolini, no doubt about it. Mussolini's an admirer of him.
Yes.
Yeah.
What did Mussolini said? This is the title of my chapter on the New Deal in Renegade History. Mussolini said of Roosevelt, "Behold, a dictator." Hitler was also a great admirer of Franklin Roosevelt, wrote a letter, multiple letters to the White House praising him for the work he had done on behalf of the American people. That's quoting Hitler. The Gestapo's newspaper, the Beobachter, consistently praised Roosevelt for his New Deal policies in particular. The New Deal is what the fascists loved about Roosevelt because they saw a brethren in Roosevelt and the New Dealers. So let's talk about it. So some people don't know what are the nuts and bolts of it. Let's talk about the actual New Deal policies, which he's most famous for and most lauded for by Democrats and liberals to this day. As I said, this is what they want to revive from the FDR legacy. Most of all, they want a New Deal. They want to go back to that. So what were the particular programs of the New Deal that were most important?
Well, there's the initial stage of the New Deal, sometimes to the first New Deal, and
Hmm.
then there's another wave in 1935. But the first New Deal is often forgotten by people on the left. But that was really where it all started,
Yep.
and that was really what inspired FDR. The two main programs were the National Recovery Administration, which imposed a vast system of wage, price controls, limits on hours. They actually prosecuted a guy for charging 35 cents for pressing a suit when the minimum NRA price for pricing a suit was 40 cents. This guy actually went to jail for doing that. So people actually went to jail. And what the National Recovery Administration was, it's corporatism, which is in theory, it's a partnership between big business, big government, and or the public. I guess I don't know what they or maybe they'll say the public and big labor.
Right.
In reality, though, labor unions were they were junior partners. They were sort of brought on board, but it was mainly a partnership between big business and big government.
Right.
And this ended up getting a lot of criticism on the left. FDR, because of things I told you, people getting arrested, they felt they needed to do FDR and his supporters need to do an investigation. So they brought in the aged lawyer, doesn't seem so aged now, Clarence Darrow, famous Scopes trial lawyer. And they thought, oh, this is an old progressive. We'll bring him in to investigate. He's sort of popular. He'll give us a clean bill of health. And Darrow just went off like, this is horrible. He recognized that this is just selling out to big business and criticized it. So there ended up being some criticism of the NRA on the left. So that's one example, clear corporatism. And then, of course, you got the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which ruthlessly tries to limit supply. It does it through a series of subsidies, and most notoriously, a lot of subsidies are given to big southern planters, and these planters take the money, and then they don't need to produce as much because they're getting all the money. Um, so what they do is they kick a lot of their tenants and their sharecroppers off the land. So this is a catastrophic situation for African Americans. And if you look at the Chicago Daily Defender, which is probably the main black newspaper, one of the two main ones,
Yep.
some incredible editorial cartoons about
Oh yeah.
what is comparing Uncle Sam to Simon Legree
Mm.
and driving people off the land, but also making some very biting criticism of the NRA, which, for example, they have one that our cartoon where some black person is trying to get a job and he says, honey, I've got this new job because the good old NRA is limiting minimizing hours and maximizing the amount of hours and minimizing the putting minimum wages on and putting limits on prices and so forth. And the next panel of the cartoon shows him of going to work, and the sign says because of the NRA policies, limiting hours and imposing minimum wages and minimum prices, we are hiring whites only, right?
Hmm.
Because again, he'd been priced out of the market. And so a lot of African Americans were simply priced out of the market. And you had massive unemployment. So a lot of these employers said, I don't get any benefit from hiring black workers. Assuming these employers are racist, they're just going to hire whites. And so you had that kind of thing happening. And that is very much criticized by African Americans at the time. But those are really the two linchpin policies for the New Deal, for the first New Deal,
Yeah.
is the NRA and the AAA.
Yep. So the NRA, I want to get to the specifics on that because, again, people don't quite get this, and it is remarkable that the left continues to hail this. The NRA was a system in which, in every major industry in the United States of America, there was established a board, a committee
Mm-hmm.
with members, with representatives from the federal government, as you said, and from labor and from business who sit on this board to decide in the industry, as you said, how high, what wages would be, um, what working conditions would be. Production and distribution was decided by these boards. An outright control. Now, the thing is, this wasn't outright nationalization because you had business and the public somewhat represented there, but the federal government always had supremacy in that, right? The federal government, if it wanted something done in a particular industry, that's what was done. Those boards in the United States, they were called cartels in Italy, and they were called, I forget, cooperative organizations, I think, in Germany. They were exactly the same economic system in all three countries during fascism. So, and by the way, you and I are not the first historians to say this, to argue this. It's just plain as day. There's no denying it. This was a fascist country from 1933 at least till 1935. I would argue continued on, but the economic system was identical among the three: Hitler's, Mussolini's, and Roosevelt's. Wolfgang Schimmelbusch has this great book called Three New Deals that you referenced. And I recommend it. If anybody wants a quick primer on this, that's the book. Three New Deals. That's the name of the book. And that's what Schimmelbusch argues, German historian, that they were the same. Also, of course, with zero regard for civil liberties and civil rights in all three regimes throughout. And we're going to get into that. And that's where your book really shines, and your previous book, too, showing how FDR, probably the most dictatorial of all the presidents, which is saying something because he's in competition with Lincoln and Wilson. But he was, I think. So it's remarkable, or maybe it's not, that the left continues to call for a renewal of fascism. Or maybe it's not remarkable. Maybe this just shows what the modern American left truly is. It not only was it fascist, but as you've said, it didn't even cure the depression. It was still 20% unemployment at the end of that period after NRA. In fact, I think it was worse, right? In the late 30s, I think unemployment was
Went
at its
back up again during the 37, 38.
highest, right? So,
Depression number two was called
right.
at the time. Yeah.
So I mean, just that alone, and there's so much more we're going to talk about with FDR. There is so much more that should be horrifying to pretty much everyone in American politics now, except for Curtis Yarvin and the monarchists. And Curtis Yarvin has told me and other people that he does admire FDR greatly. I think he's his favorite president, in fact, which makes perfect sense. That's Curtis Yarvin, a principled monarchist, knowing what he should know. Um, so yes, what do you make of that? Like, what do you make of the fact that an outright, obviously fascist national government was in place in the early 1930s, and that is the government that is most celebrated, even by Trump, even by people in MAGA, right? They love FDR. They think he's great, in part because of his economic programs and in part because of his war making. It's
Well,
remarkable.
The great historian Robert Higgs, would talked about FDR, the system being fascist, and he said people get all upset. Like, well, you're not comparing this to, you know, whatever. You're not comparing this to dictatorial Nazism or the Holocaust and all that. And he said his term was participatory fascism,
Yeah.
which I rather like. So, okay, we still have elections, we still have some veneer of democracy, participatory fascism. And I think that that's a very fair point. I mean, especially when you look at these people, like Rexford Tugwell,
Mm,
would be examples
my
of that.
favorite.
The big New Dealers,
Mhm.
um, they are saying that. They are saying essentially we're doing what Mussolini did. And and FDR is sort of able to rebrand himself. I think that's part of what happens is that he really, because he's on the attack from the left for his poor civil liberties record,
Mm.
he does these things like the Four Freedoms. He gives the Four Freedoms speech. And he's able to rebrand himself, quite ironically, as someone who is uh, a defender of civil liberties, of the Bill of Rights, right? Um, 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 and we have Bill of Rights Day and all these celebrations, but that only comes later because FDR had this atrocious civil liberties record, and he was losing support among his left-wing base. They didn't like it. They didn't really have anywhere else to go, though, and he sort of appeased them with starting to talk about the Bill of Rights, starting to talk about things like the Four Freedoms. But if you look at FDR till, oh, I don't know, circa 1940, he doesn't talk about the Bill of Rights very often. It's not something he's that interested in. And FDR, really the opposite. FDR has a certain strand of progressivism that he agrees with, which was what I call ends oriented.
Mm.
Get the job done. Don't
Yes.
worry about these procedures. Don't worry about due process. Don't worry about precedent. He's borrowing that indirectly, I think, from someone like Herbert Crowley,
Uh-huh.
right?
Yeah.
Who makes that argument. He's using Hamiltonian means, he would probably say this, something like it, to advance what he sees as Jeffersonian ends, namely equality or justice or something like that.
Mm.
Perhaps if we had him sitting down here, he'd try to make that argument. But FDR is no great thinker. He's no intellectual. But in a rough sense, that's his attitude: get the job done.
That
And
was
he latches onto this Bill of Rights rhetoric really as a defensive measure. And he's been successful because I think that's part of the mystique about him. He's the defender of the Bill of Rights and democracy and all of that. Of course, he's fighting Hitler too. That helps increase that reputation.
yeah.
But he very much cultivates that,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
Democracy,
Right.
fair play.
Right. Hitler said the same thing about the German working class. He wanted justice and democracy and freedom for them, not for anyone who wasn't German, and FDR. And so he instituted, Hitler and Mussolini, part of their economic program, just like with FDR and the New Deal was, we haven't talked about this yet, the immense public works projects, which that's what the leftists today just love. Oh man, every socialist I've never known just gets warm and fuzzy inside when they think about the Hoover Dam and all the libraries that were built and the trails that were built by the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, et cetera, right? Talk about that. The public
The
works projects.
WPA, here's a
W.
good one.
Oh, yeah.
Uh, Arguably, what was the biggest WPA project of all time?
Uh,
Try this on for size: Japanese internment.
yeah.
And this is part of the WPA's history and Harry Hopkins' history that is not talked about very much. And
They,
this is why I think FDR is vulnerable to criticism. Now, on the Japanese internment, when FDR signed his executive order, they didn't have the bureaucratic infrastructure to put it together, right? So when the Japanese were rounded up and transferred, they were sent to camps administered by WPA bureaucrats. The WPA spent more than any other single government agency, including the Army, in the early stages of Japanese internment. This
Hmm.
has only recently been, there's some very good historical work on this, but only recently has this happened. And I cite this work, and nobody shot it down. So that's an interesting aside on the whole public works issue,
Yeah.
but that puts a little bit of tarnish on somebody on the left who's saying,
Right.
gee, can't we get these great public work projects? Of course, as we already pointed out, we still have double digit unemployment.
Mm.
So it didn't really do the job that was supposed to do. But these could be used for a lot of different purposes, as they were in Nazi Germany, as they were in Italy, as they were in the United States. So I think that that is one issue I would often highlight when I'm trying to sway opinions among FDR admirers, who often will point to the WPA or things like it as one of the reasons they love FDR so much. These same people were good Germans.
Yeah.
Yeah, these WPA bureaucrats, they did the job. They built the guard towers, the searchlights,
The whole thing.
right?
They
The
built
barbed wire, the whole thing,
the
and they did a
camps.
good, efficient job
Yeah.
using their building skills that they had used quite effectively to build camps during the New Deal.
Okay. So what we're talking about is the Works Progress Administration for those who are
Yes.
following. Um, no, so they did build all the camps for Japanese internment. True. But David, that was not their biggest project. The biggest project of the WPA was building or rebuilding the American military. Do you know this? I mean, most of the WPA funding ended up building aircraft carriers and Air Force bases and tanks that were used to go to war against Japan and Germany long before Japan and Germany were considered of any concern to anyone in America.
Who's
FD,
written about this? That sounds like great stuff. That's something I could have
me,
talked about in my book. Yeah,
me,
you.
it's in my,
Well, there you
I mean,
go.
somewhat, there are a couple people. I mean, I had to find it in places, but it's out there, but it will be in my forthcoming book, which will be
Oh
published
boy.
in October.
Mm.
But, so, and I want to get, so let's talk about the war making. Um, I have a different take on Japanese internment, probably a surprising one for you. I don't know if you know my take on Japanese internment. It was, and you gotta like let me. You're not gonna don't jump on me before I finish the argument. It was absolutely logical, rational, and I would say justified within the context of the world that FDR had created. Meaning, and this is not in your book either, and it should be,
Mhm.
which is that there was substantial, massive evidence, I would say, of Japanese Americans, Nisei and Issei, both the immigrants and the first generation immigrants who were living in America, of their devotion to the Japanese Empire, of their devotion to the Japanese emperor, to their devotion to the Japanese cause in the war. Why? Why? Because for 40 years since Japanese immigration began, the progressives and FDR had launched the most vicious, disgusting, racist attacks on Japanese Americans' rights in this country. There were segregated schools in San Francisco. The public schools were segregated. There were schools for Japanese kids and schools for white kids. But then most egregiously was the 1924 alien land law in California, overseen by our very progressive governor Hiram Johnson, who is still a hero among lefties and progressives, which expropriated all of the land and property of the Japanese farmers in California who had become the most successful farmers in the state. The most important agricultural state was being dominated by Japanese farmers because they were just good at it. And so they were outperforming, outproducing the white native born farmers. And so the state of California took their land and then gave it to white farmers. And then, of course, there was just a flood in John Dower's book, by the way, War Without Mercy, I think it's called.
Yeah, that's right.
That's the
Hmm.
best history on all this. Just unbelievable flood of anti-Japanese racism. Not, I mean, during the war, of course, it peaked, but it had been going on from the 1900s all the way through the 1930s, just again and again and again. American political leaders talking about Japanese as vicious brutes, conniving scumbag aliens who needed to be removed from the body politic. One example, FDR, when he was out of politics in the 1920s and living in Georgia, was a columnist, started writing a column for the Macon Journal, the newspaper in Macon. And he wrote these columns talking about how Japanese people and people from Asia and otherwise are indigestible. That was the word. They could not be, we couldn't assimilate these people ever. They can never, so we must expel them. Uh, so, so it's no wonder that when in the late 30s, when FDR and then the American establishments starts calling for war, in 1937, he basically starts calling for war openly with Japan. It's no wonder that Japanese schools all around California, Oregon, and Hawaii were preaching loyalty to the emperor and and preaching resistance against the American imperialists who were denying them rights here when they were contributing more to the economy than the native born people, and whose country never posed any threat whatsoever to the United States at all. So there's all sorts of evidence of this, especially in Hawaii, but also on the West Coast here, of tremendous anti-American, pro-Japanese sentiment among Japanese people living here. So once the war begins, once FDR forces, and we'll get into this, forces Japan to attack Pearl Harbor and launches this annihilatory war against that people and that country and its people, they were, in fact, yes, very likely to have served as saboteurs or espionage agents inside the United States. So we had to, by that point, after launching a war, which is a 50-year process, by the way, for FDR, he'd been launching a war, attempting to launch a war against Japan since he was literally a teenager. We'll get into that. While leading the campaign to deny them of their rights here, yes, he had no choice but to lock those people up because they were going to subvert the war effort. So it's not a defensive internment. It's an opposition to war making and racism. That's where my argument is. Does that make sense?
I disagree with some of that. I think that you can certainly find evidence that the Japanese government was trying to influence Japanese American opinion, was sinking a lot of money to bringing Japanese to study and Japanese Americans to study in Japan, to go to schools there, sinking a lot of money into education for Japanese American children. But if you look at, the stats I've seen, these efforts were not that successful. I mean, very few Japanese Americans spoke native born, US born Japanese Americans spoke Japanese, for example. Um, so,
You mean they spoke English? What?
I mean, yeah, they spoke English. I'm sorry, very few of them spoke. Did I say English or Japanese?
Well, the native born, the American
The
born
ones born in the United States,
spoke English.
very few of them spoke Japanese.
Correct. Yes.
These efforts to so yeah, you had if you look at the Japanese language press, they tend to take the
That's it.
pro Japan position, but the Americans, at least the ones born in the US, Japanese Americans are not in a position to read those newspapers because they're not learning the language. So I'm not so sure that the Japanese efforts were that successful in swaying opinion. I think they did view Japanese immigrants in America as a potential loyal fifth column of sorts. But you could look at all the resources spent on that, but how effective were they?
Okay, the book on this is John Stephan, Stephan. Again, I recommend everybody
Mm-hmm.
Read that. Historian at the University of Hawaii. He wrote the book on this, and there is just abundant evidence that there was massive donations made by Japanese Americans to the nation state of Japan. There were hundreds, maybe thousands, I think it was, thousands of Japanese Americans who defected back to Japan to serve in the Imperial Army. And yes, in the schools up and down the West Coast and in Hawaii, they are, as you say, preaching a pro-Japan line. And there's lots of evidence that Japanese, again, for good reason, right? Why wouldn't Japanese Americans want to fight against America at that point?